Yeah, okay, so I can say this without anyone getting too ticked off. Nerds!
Yeah, and?
Exactly.
Yeah, the guy raises his hand. He's like, yeah, I do data entry, not computer programming. I'm not a nerd. Classic. Yeah.
But yes,
All right, so
should
shall
I start?
Yeah.
Sure. Oh god, I'm in the center. Does that mean I have to introduce this? Okay. Hi everyone, welcome to Writing Foundations Intermediate. I think we should get started by introducing one another. Should we go down?
I'll start. Hi, I'm Fugue. I work at Silk Wolf Press doing editor, behind the booth kind of things, so that's what I do.
Hi, I'm Skunk Bomb. I've been writing in the fandom since 2015, and I've got a few stories under my belt at this point, including a story in Fang 9, which can be purchased later on during the con at the Fur Planet table.
Hi everybody, I'm Bo Jackal. I've been writing for many years, and at some point people started trying to give me money to do it, and I actually found out that it's not what my creative engine runs on, which was awkward for me. But I've kept writing because it's fun. I've done a bunch of collaborations, a bunch of trades, a bunch of just satisfying stuff like that. And just a few weeks ago, I won the 2018 Ursa Major for Best Short Story. So like, so I feel like I actually belong here for once. I've done a few of these, and I'd always look to my left like, why am I up here? I'm not a real person. But yeah, glad to have you guys all here.
Yay.
So the fun part of this panel is it's the intermediate writing panel, which isn't always that clear on what we should talk about, so it almost feels like we have to field questions almost immediately. Unless people have good ideas what to chat about.
I am not against that idea.
Okay.
Yeah, we actually have a really big crowd, so I bet there's questions out there.
I know it works better than I do now.
The heckling has begun.
I think I can answer that. Actually, if you want to write better than what you already do now, step outside your comfort zone and give it to people that don't know you constantly, and ask for legitimate critiques.
Yep.
And
So
give
that
it to
actually-
other writers as well, even ones that you actually appreciate.
Yeah, so that actually brings up the great point of a good thing to talk about, which is beta, doing betas. So those of you who are not familiar with the terminology, doing a beta read for something means you are reading a story for someone else and giving kind of a baseline level of critique on it. You know, this is not a finished product, but what do you think, sort of thing. It's generally considered a fairly common stage in the writing process of, okay, I finished a story, what do I do with it now? Get a beta on it, then start looking to submit it. It's a fairly standard thing. Doesn't always happen, but I tend to recommend it as a good thing to do for a lot of beginning writers because it helps get you that another viewpoint on it besides just what might be in a, especially if you're sending out for publication, for a yes, this is accepted, no, it's not, right? It gives you some actual feedback in there, which you don't always get otherwise.
And feedback from other writers is useful, but don't say like they have to be a writer, like writer or plus. Like anyone literate can tell you like, okay, this part was confusing. You know, you said he dropped the knife here, but 2 pages later he has the knife. What's the deal with that? There's a lot of like, you need someone that's outside of your head to see if what you're saying comes across clearly, because you have the answer key. So if you read your own work, it's like, well, of course I expressed that clearly. But it makes a big difference if someone without all of your world building looks at it.
Right. I feel like once you get sort of in the intermediate area, I mean, it's already nerve-wracking handing your work to someone and saying, hey, could you read this and give me feedback on it? I think once you start getting into the intermediate level, I think it's a good idea to definitely come to the beta reading process with questions in mind, like specific questions like, hey, I feel like setting is something I really need to work on. How does it work out here? Just if you have any sort of specific questions, definitely go into the process with them. And
especially ask for a concentration if you're trying something new. You're saying like, hey, this is my first time writing from the perspective of a female character. Find a female friend and say like, look at that specifically, because I'm not one of those. And I've done that and phrased it exactly that way. And she was like, thank you, because she's read a lot of man writing girl, and it's very obvious because you get the like, oh, she walked googly down the stairs with her boobs swinging, and it's just like, no, that's not how it works. What's the rating of this panel?
I don't think it's an adult panel.
Crap. I'm glad we caught that.
I think we can do PG-13.
Yes.
I think we can do PG-13.
Okay. I think boobs are PG-13. All right.
But
Glad we caught that early.
You did touch on something that I think is something that once you're in the intermediate level, you might want to think about doing is trying to write something outside of your comfort zone, or trying to maybe bend sort of those writer rules that you were told, but hadn't tried to really bend before. Have either of you, in your writings, have you ever like tried to bend those rules, those like writer rules you were given when you were first starting out?
Yeah, do that reasonably often. So I'm trying, like the story I had recently published in Dissident Signals, available for purchase at Fur Planet. I wrote it as kind of an old style sci-fi story. The first person narrative, the very talky, lot less dewy kind of, almost an Asimov style of story, which is something that's very much gone out of favor in modern science fiction. And so I was like, okay, well, let me try it. Let me put that on, see how it feels, give it a shot. And I certainly found some things about it which were like, okay, yeah, I like this element of this style. And I also found things about it in doing it that were like, okay, I can see why that went out of style.
Right in the fashion of E.E. Doc Smith.
It is fun to experiment. Like, you learn a lot, not just about writing, but just like general knowledge. You can broaden stuff. They always say write what you know, and that was my defiance. I wrote about a character who was a nurse working in a hospital, which are two things that I know nothing about. And there was a lot of research that went into that. I had a lot of time to write because I was in the Navy, and so we were just like stuck out in the water. I'm like, well, I'm in this metal box, I may as well write stuff. And so I'd like go to the ship's surgeon and pick his brain about stuff. And I'm glad I'm not on that ship anymore, because he probably thinks I'm out of my mind. Because I'd just like drop by, I'd be like, hey doc, so if you were in this situation, like, would nitroforin work? And he's just like, no. Just don't. Where would you even get nitroforin? Is that like Dark Ages leech saliva stuff? Why? I have so many questions, but I want you to not answer them and leave my sickbay. The researching process can also be really fun if I had brought that across.
The great saying of "I'm a writer, not a serial murderer."
Yes.
Please Google. I'm not a serial
Oh
murderer.
man! Now that Google search histories are a thing, it's just the worst.
One of my favorite stories along those lines is Tempeh Okun, who has a couple of books for sale down there. He at one point had to ask someone, who's like, okay, if you swallowed a scorpion, would it kill you before your stomach basically killed it? And the person who was asking this question was like, oh, it's okay, I'm a writer. Oh, okay, well then.
Asking for a friend.
Yeah.
Please respond quickly.
I'm always amused by, if you follow Ursula Vernon's, her Twitter, she has some amusing interactions with, I believe, a police officer.
Yes.
Color crime.
My response would have been, that depends on the scorpion.
Yeah. Was it cooked? Because you got to cook scorpion.
Crunchy is best.
I got a question.
I saw his hand go up first, but I will go to you next after him.
About exposition. When you're world building, I mean, it's not like Jack Vance or Hal Clement where you can take 20 pages with no action and no dialogue and explain something, how a world got built. Think about Mission of Gravity. In the paperback, he takes like 5 pages just explaining the planet. One guy's sitting there talking to another person. You can't do that anymore. So how do you get that level of exposition in a world building situation? How do you get that level of exposition without losing your reader?
A good way to start is to think of it kind of like it's a video game, You know, your camera is following your character, and as that character does whatever their mission is, whatever they're trying to do, they encounter aspects of the world along the way. And so you pick up this tape recording that explains what awful disaster happened in this room, or you go to some store that sells cybernetic augmentations, and you just pick up the details of the world from the way the characters are interacting with them, or from what happens along the path that the characters are taking and what they're trying to do. Exposition works best if you use it in an as necessary kind of way, because if you just do that brick of exposition, it's like there's a layer of homework inside the story. This is like, oh, all this exciting stuff is happening. Now history textbook. And I won't say nobody likes that, because never say never, but very few people like that. And so if you're saying like, okay, let me wait for an opening in the narrative where this information is relevant, then your reader is going to be saying like, well, the character is encountering this problem where they need this information. Now I'm interested, please tell me about it. And so it's much more interesting to read it when it applies to what the actions is going on, what the characters are doing.
And to briefly follow up on that, you say it doesn't work anymore, but the truth is it does depending on genre. So like what you're describing is the classic hard science fiction story. And hard science fiction is still something that is being written and it's still being sold and it's still being read. But that is a very specific audience where someone who is picking up a book to read hard sci-fi wants all that exposition. And if that is the kind of writer you want to be, then find the way also to craft it for the kind of reader who wants to read that.
Yeah, and that's why I said I won't say nobody likes that, because there are people who like that. When you said like, oh, the people like this who do that like Tolkien, like, well, those are successful authors that put exposition bricks in their work. So they did something right.
Mission of Gravity, right? Classic. But if it was written today, I don't even know if it would get published.
It would. It would just,
Even
again,
hard
be
science,
a
when
specific
he
hard
starts
science.
talking about gravitational fields and exponential law and
Yeah.
everything. It's like, you
Oh,
have
that's
to have
done all the
math
time in
to
hard
keep
science fiction.
up with
Yeah.
it.
The Expanse series is wildly popular. It's pretty hard sci-fi for at least what you're looking at these days.
I guess my advice on the exposition subject would just be, if you're writing, maybe try piecing it out a bit instead of having like a brick of exposition text. Again, try piecing it out. I agree with about like sort of like you're following the character, and then maybe there's a little bit of exposition depending on something that they interact with.
Yeah, if you want to talk about like getting out of your comfort zone, something that's worked for me is writing in first person. Historically has been difficult for me, but it gets me away from exposition bricks because it takes away my narrative voice. Like, if I want to get information to the reader, I can't just say, here you go, reader, because I don't have that. It's just characters, and so I have to engineer a way to put that information in the world and then have the characters interact with it. So that might be a good tool for you to use to, put on the ankle weights and force yourself to learn those skills.
I've actually been having the opposite problem. I usually write in first person, and I recently tried to write something in third person, and I'm tearing my hair out currently.
Yeah. So yeah, try something that you're not used to, I guess is the message there. Maybe we should trade notes sometime.
I feel the slight urge because you mentioned the name of Tolkien.
Yeah.
And there are two things with
we
regards
say it
to
again, we'll
Tolkien
summon his ghost.
for which I dissuade authors from doing, especially authors who are kind of right around this skill level. The first of which is, please, when you're trying to pitch a story, do not compare it to Lord of the Rings. Not because it might not be accurate or not accurate, but because everyone compares their story to Lord of the Rings. And at this point it has just been so overdone that it is a meaningless comparison. It's like, my story is like Lord of the Rings. Yes. So is
like,
all of the fantasy genre.
Yeah. It's like how every video game is like, we're going to be the next Fortnite. And I'm just like, yeah, I've heard that 16 times today. It doesn't mean anything anymore.
Yeah, and the other side of the Tolkien bit is the whole, like you were bringing up, with the prologue that is just, let's build the world, and let's go through 20 pages of just telling you what a hobbit is. And a lot of people, because of that, try and do the prologue of the world building, which we kind of really try and push a lot of writers not to do, in part because J.R.R. Tolkien was a brilliant, absolutely brilliant writer, and you are not necessarily him, so don't try and immediately do what he did all the time.
You gotta have a big name before you can give people homework and they'll like it.
I mean, and when was that published originally?
54?
Yeah.
So
People had nothing else to do.
Well, it's like when
It
you
was
read
consistent
historical
with the
stuff.
time.
If you go read something that was written in the 19th century, like it's going to have a really different feel from a modern text. So like, don't necessarily also try and write something that feels like Tolkien.
Yeah. So when you say this is like Lord of the Rings, it's like you're saying, oh, you mean it's really outdated and kind of weirdly racist? I don't think we want to.
So well, this is just like, kid, like, oh, you gotta be careful with that.
I know that you had a question, and then after that, I saw that you had your hand up as well.
So I'm kind of in a weird spot between like intermediate and beginner, just because this is my first writing panel. I've never taken any kind of official writing classes, but I've been writing since I was 9 years old. I'm 25 right now. So I've kind of established the way I write just from picking from what I've read. And you mentioned writer rules that we're all told, and it's like, what do you mean by that? Because I have no concept of it.
I want to give the 2 rules that probably everyone has heard at some point, but you should absolutely toss them out. And these are basic grammatical rules. The never end a sentence on a preposition. Forget about it, toss it out. You can perfectly end a sentence on a preposition. Second, which is don't split infinitives. To boldly go, to go, split with boldly. Yeah, that's perfectly fine to do. The reason why grammarians at some point decided you can't do that is because in Latin, you literally cannot split an infinitive because it is one word. And they decided that's how it should be in English too.
I got around those by never learning the parts of speech. I don't know what those rules mean.
I was the weirdo who in like 6th grade English class, we had the book with the, here's the nominative case and the...
Yeah. You were in the back like, I
went
wait
through
to
that book
diagram
like
these
crazy.
sentences.
That's so much fun.
I would have suggested that you go to the Writing Foundation's beginner, but that was earlier, and unfortunately we don't have time travel. But
YouTube.
oh yeah, it might be recorded, so you might be able to find it after the con. But I guess in terms of writer rules, one that I hear that I think was mentioned earlier was write what you know. I don't think that's going to work because there are so many things that people can be curious about and they want to know more about. Plus, I'm not that smart or knowledgeable, so that's going to be very limiting, at least for me. But so I think the edit to that rule is write what you want to know, and if you don't know certain things, there's a bunch of information on the internet. You can talk to people who have had certain experiences, like if you write a story with like a police officer in it, you could see if you can contact the police officer and ask some questions. If you have a story written through the perspective of someone who suffers from depression or something, you could ask someone online or look at resources from people who have depression. So if you're curious about it, definitely write about it, and if you need to do research, definitely do the research.
Yeah.
When we say writer rules, a lot of the time what we mean is sort of like training wheels, sort of like early things where it's like, hey, try to avoid these early pitfalls so that your early writing is in a way that fosters growth. Because there are certain things that a lot of early writers do wrong and that kind of gets them into a rut. So we're saying like, hey, this is the most effective way to develop your voice and grow faster rather than like getting bad habits ingrained early on. As you find your voice, as you start to figure out what you like and what you're good at, then you can start breaking those rules. Because a lot of the great writing defies convention and does its own thing.
Just because I just thought of it, one of the great writing rules that gets repeated around a lot, and again, isn't necessarily true, but is helpful in this regard, is to not use adverbs, right? And this is just because there's a lot of adverbs which people over-rely on. There are authors who have to search and replace the word very or just in their entire story because they use it almost every sentence. And the moment you're doing that, it's a word that's over present. There's also like a lot of the ly adverbs that should you really be saying, what is it, the Tom Swifties of the, gosh, I can't even remember what they go, but it's like making almost silly adverbs with an ly to just stick into a sentence, and some authors over-rely on that. And so this has caused the writer rule to come out where you say, okay, don't use adverbs unless absolutely necessary, which is not true. Adverbs have their place, just like every other part of speech, but some writers do over-rely on them, so that writer rule was in part to try and tamp that down.
It's sort of like show, don't tell, right? And in fact, you could argue that an adverb is a form of telling.
Well, it is one of those things where we say like, oh, adverbs are bad, and it's like, well, they're not bad. It's like in diet saying salt is bad. No, you need salt to live, but broadly, most people are getting too much of it. So we're saying like, hey, back off on the adverbs a little bit, because it's very common to overuse them. And you'll see that a lot in writing advice, that we use counter examples to try and get our point across. Because it's much easier to say like, hey, does your writing look like this? And that will much more easily like flag in your mind like, oh yeah, I'm doing this thing where the character speaks aloud how they feel. I should probably not do that. And that's much more instructive and much easier to implement than us saying like, oh, try to make your dialogue more expressive. It's harder to turn that advice into a meaningful change in your writing than it is to say, look for this common problem, try to implement this solution. So those are the rules of writing, is to say, try and steer yourself towards this because it will help you develop as a writer. But if you're in a situation where you're like, they told me this was against the rules, but I feel it would serve the story, then go with that. Your instincts are probably leading you well in that case.
Yeah, because I put a bunch of my own projects out on like FA, and I sell commissions and stuff already, and I do get positive feedback, and I find a hard time getting negative feedback, as you're mentioning, getting critiques. And it's like, I just feel like I've stagnated over the past couple of years. It's like I'm stuck in a rut, and I don't know how to get out of it.
That's why we say try something new. If you try something new, you'll make more mistakes, people will hate it, and then give you negative feedback. Ask me how I know.
Find an editor to look it over.
Yeah.
Definitely, maybe look around online for other writers, especially if it's like they're at like a similar writing level as you, or like a little bit higher, and maybe like contact them and say, hey, would you be interested in doing something like a beta swap? A beta swap, in case anyone does not know, is just, hey, I'll if you read my story and give feedback, I will read one of your stories and give you feedback as well. I know there was a gentleman in the back with glasses, white shirt, that had a question earlier.
It's actually for Conference East 1996.
Oh.
The first and so far only furry convention in Cleveland.
Oh.
Hope there'll be another sometime. Anyway, getting back to fantasy for a moment, I've heard it said that the entire limits of the genre were returned by both Lord of the Rings and Conan the Barbarian.
I don't know that I would agree with that, just because I think that has set a lot of what our initial expectations are, like fairies and orcs and elves and all of that sort of stuff we borrow so heavily on from Tolkien, but there's still plenty of authors these days that are jumping way out of that. Like I recently read N.K. Jemisin, Broken Earth trilogy, and that one goes in a completely different direction from anything like Tolkien.
That's how to reach out. I gotta read that.
Yeah.
There are a number of hands. I think I saw one back there a while ago.
So, in all honesty, earlier you used a comp title. How often are those done in the fandom?
A what?
Comp title? Don't compare your story to Lord of the Rings.
So like when you're submitting a story for like an anthology or to get like a novel published, when you're submitting it to whoever's going to be reading the email, like the editor, you want to compare, you want to do a comp tile, but you don't want to do like Tolkien. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I would say that's reasonably common. Probably 50% of emails we receive in that vein are going to say somehow, hey, this is especially true at the novel level, because at the novel levels, people are really trying to pitch a specific vision for the overarching story, whereas for a short story, it's typically, most anthologies in the fandom are already themed, so you don't have to pitch to, like, if you're pitching, say, to one of Tarl's horror anthologies, you don't have to compare it to a specific horror thing because he already knows it's going to be horror. At least he hopes it's already going to be horror if you're submitting it to a horror anthology.
I remember I saw your hand up a while ago.
Yeah, I have been writing for quite a while, like both for comics and novels, and normally whenever I was writing for the furry fandom, it was specifically for comics, but I'd like to move that more into my novel work, but I don't really know how to get anthropomorphic characters in a way that helps to enhance the story. So I thought maybe at like this convention, sorry.
But yeah, I mean, that's totally valid because hey, if you're going to write for the furry fandom, you definitely want to add as much furriness as possible. I think the clearest path would definitely be thinking about like how species would interact with one another, how to maybe do research into certain species, there's like some classic examples like cat and mouse, they might not get along, dog and cat, they might not get along, and there's also, of course, species, I mean, there's fandom stereotypes. There's
aware of some of them, yeah.
Yes, maybe some not quite flattering ones involving boxes and promiscuity,
Right.
which isn't always true, of course. You can certainly play with that in a story. But yes, certainly, like especially if you're looking around the fandom, maybe look around and see what people are doing with species, and that could be fodder for adding more furriness to your story, and also looking at sort of more species in a more biological terms, like the classic cat and mouse type of thing.
Okay.
The good litmus test to use for your work, and if you're looking for examples elsewhere, is just to say, why can't they be human? If you took this furry story and you reskinned everyone as a human, would the story be any different?
That's the problem.
If it makes no difference, that is a bad sign. So what I'm saying is look for those differences. If there are artists that you like or writers that you like, look at their work and see like, oh well, yeah, a human couldn't have done this because this character has this poker tell that relates to the movement of their ears.
Okay.
Or like this character is an investigator that depends on their sense of smell because they're a dog.
Okay.
These different things.
In a couple
But
of my
hey,
stories, there's entire investigative units of police forces that are all dogs.
Mhm.
Okay.
Or you
Or
have
wolf.
this fantasy story, like, hey, the fact that being a werewolf is this condition that you can catch and you can turn into that thing, that's certainly a plot point. That's certainly something people are going to think about, and it's going to affect the behavior of the characters. So, look for the ways in which being furry makes a furry story different, and then try to incorporate some of those into your writing. Ears and tails, whiskers and mobile noses, they're all very expressive. You can do a lot with those. You can communicate a lot more with body language and all of those little touches. But yeah, there are also the abilities, there are the animal mindsets. Predators and prey respond very differently to stress. A predator is going to get a little more violent and aggressive. A prey is probably going to try to run or hide. Lots of different things that you can incorporate into the personalities of your characters.
Okay.
And I'd even go so far as to say sometimes you don't have to make it directly explicit what's going on, because for example, the differences between predator and prey species, I'm thinking of, predators might be either solitary or in a pack, whereas you might have prey species that have the massive herd. Mm-hmm. And you could represent this just by having, okay, well, I have a prey species, they have a massive social circle. Whereas maybe a predator species has a very tight social circle.
Yes.
And you could just have that be something that's in the background without even you having to say, oh, by the way, they're a prey species, so they have a massive social circle.
Right.
Right? You're allowed to be implicit on things.
Okay.
One thing that helped me with my characters was I'm big in biology, metabolism. The metabolism of the animal and their own energy levels as that animal. So like smaller, say rodent characters are a lot like scary, jumpy, nervous. Whereas a horse character is a little mellow, slow, chill.
All right.
And the practical aspects are fun to talk about a lot of the time. I hear it called fergonomics, like, you know, getting the weird leg shapes to work in chairs or with controls of cars, or just like the little details, the practical aspects of just like, you know, if you have to eat 35 pounds of grass in a day, like that's gonna shape your routine a little bit if you're a horse.
I mean, you're also
Just get in there and really overthink it, and you'll come up with a lot of stuff.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Like,
And,
this is giving me a lot. Thank you, guys.
no problem.
How do you play musical instruments if you have claws?
Yeah.
Very carefully.
I actually did a story
Try
where
fursuiting, because then you'll have those experiences. You'll get into an elevator with pillow paws the size of trash can lids and look at the buttons like, why am I like this?
Then you end up using your nose.
Yeah, and then you move it with your nose.
I actually did a story where there was a piano that had to have padded keys because with the predator species and the sharp claw tips, otherwise they would ruin the keys.
Right, where you like, there's a lot of wind instruments. Like you'd have to be creative in finding justification for how a dog person can play trumpet.
Yeah. Or if you have like a cyberpunk story and there's a retinal scanner and someone has like a big long muzzle and they're like, oh, I hate these things. I only get 3 more attempts. Yeah.
If I might, it actually reminded me a lot of the manga B-Stars because that's probably a very good way to do it because it's visual more than anything.
The what?
B-Stars, it's a manga.
Okay.
Surprisingly, not a lot of furries know about it.
Well, it hasn't been out in English very long.
No, it hasn't. So.
You can find it in English on a website,
Mhm.
but I don't even know if they've actually published it in only Japanese.
Mhm.
To be honest, unless you can really do stroke counts good, it's hard to read Japanese.
Real fans listen to the dub, which is where you have someone who knows both languages read it to you.
You mentioned the retinal scanners, and just dog noses are as unique as a fingerprint. And I, no shit, wrote a story where that was how they scanned. Rest of nose to nose.
That is adorable.
You're pooping the snoot.
And then the one is got a cold and it's like,
Yeah.
blow your nose.
You're trying to fingerprint a horse criminal, and he's just like, funk. Bring out what you want from me.
Oh, I saw
We're gonna be here a while, guys.
in I think it was the Out of Position series. Instead of when the Fox characters he didn't really get fingerprinted, or maybe he did, but the cop handed him a cotton swab. It's like, I need you to stick this under your tail. And that was like
Get the
the
scent gland.
identification.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I saw a hand over here, and I've seen that yours has been up for a while. So you first.
Okay. So like I'm another one of the people who are like kind of like in that middle between intermediate and beginner. But one of the things that I learned was that two things that I learned that helped me start writing like consistently was like don't edit while you write, and also so like you don't have to start at the beginning and write linearly. You can go non-linearly when you're writing. But do you have any other tips that can help like people like me who not only get motivated for writing, but stay writing so that I don't get distracted by overthinking things, just able to stay in that like groove?
The classic answer to like what's your biggest weakness at a job interview is like, oh well, I'm a perfectionist. You know, like because that's so cheeky and clever. It's just like, oh yeah, I want to do everything so awesome and super well. That's my only flaw. But actually, that is a crippling flaw. Like striving for perfection will absolutely kill your drive. You know, because if you're sitting here saying like, all right, I've got to get these 200 words absolutely polished perfect before I can move on, you'll never move on, and your story will be 3 sentences. They'll be great, I'm sure. but you'll be at that SpongeBob comic where he's got like the calligraphy,
Yeah.
and nothing else. Like let yourself just get down what you need to get out of your head, and worry about the shape of it later. The analogy that I really like is you've got to get some clay on the wheel. When you take a chunk of clay and you put it on the throwing wheel, it's just a wad. And if you're sitting there thinking like, oh no, this isn't a good wad, let me get a different wad. Oh no, that's not a perfect wad. You'll be sitting there slinging around wads all day, and you'll never make a pot.
I handle my story first.
For me, I write for anthologies, and I find nothing more motivating than when the deadline is coming up really, really soon. Nothing would get done if it wasn't for the last minute. But so, something that I've seen done, something I want to participate in more, something that I've seen done, is that if you have a community of writers, if you have like friends who are also writers, like schedule a certain time and say, hey, we're going to do a writing sprint like at 8 o'clock tonight. So we're just going to sit down, write as much as we can for like 30 minutes, and then we're like, and then we can just like talk about it afterwards. Or I've seen, I might be getting the name wrong of this this structure. I think it was a Pomodoro method or something like that. Yeah, where it's you sort of set a timer for say 15, 20 minutes, write as much as you can. Take a break for like 5 minutes and do that until the third break. You take like 20-minute break. Just being able to sort of schedule out time and say, this is when I need to sit down and write. And especially if you have some sort of deadline in mind, that I feel like is really, really helpful. Especially when there's other people and they have like, keep you in a, like, you should like keep yourself accountable, but other people shaming you is really good too.
Yeah.
Provided they're friends.
Yeah. Yes. The big part of the Pomodoro method is that it's acknowledging that both work and break are important, but you have to draw a very clear dividing line between them. Don't be typing on your computer and then check Twitter, typing on your computer and then answer this message. It helps a lot to have a separation. It helps a lot to go somewhere else to do work, or maybe just like have a little netbook that only does your word processor. Just cut out all of the break stuff while you're doing work, and then when the timer goes off, you switch. You go to the break stuff, you get it all out, and then you go back to work. Smearing the two together just leads to you wasting a bunch of time and then wondering why you didn't get anything done. Again, that's an ask me how I know that.
I will also point out, because lots of ideas are flying around, that everyone writes differently, and you should do the method that works for you, right? We can toss ideas at you, but there's no guaranteed 100% flawless method. This works for everyone. And there's some things that you might try and realize it doesn't work at all, and that's fine. That method didn't work, toss it out, try the next one.
Oh yes, all of this advice is absolutely, I'm struggling, do you know anything that would help me out? If you have something that works, I'm definitely not going to tell you like, oh no, you're succeeding wrong. How dare you? You're supposed to do it like this.
I know people who would do that.
Oh yes.
And those people are wrong.
But it's also worth it if you have a successful method to keep trying things, because maybe you may be locally optimized. Like, oh, that works pretty well.
Yeah.
Try something new. It keeps you, at least it'll keep you entertained.
Yes, I believe you in the hat in the back.
Yeah. I was just wondering, you're talking about like getting people to, beta test your writing and stuff. In my profession, I have to write a lot of reports, and
Between points.
Right. I feel that's how I am now too. I used to pants a lot when I was starting out, but I tend to forget things sometimes. Like, oh, I have this great idea, and then when it comes time to actually write it down, to write it, I've already forgotten that really cool thing I wanted to add.
Yeah,
So,
that's why I take the notes, because like the idea will be for later, and I'm just kind of like, well, I've got to get there before I can stick that in. That's a later idea. I'm not there yet. Also, I don't know if we mentioned, pantsing comes from by the seat of your pants. We've been using that word, and I'm just like, it sounds kind of weird the way we're using that word. Just clarifying.
Oh, yes.
So, how do you stop yourself going down the rabbit hole? I don't know if this is a common problem, but I find that I'm writing a story and it's supposed to be a simple short story about a spacewalk, and I've ended up inventing an entire system-wide government.
These things happen.
Yeah. I was about to say, how do I stop that? I don't. 3 years ago, I started writing a short story about werewolves, and that passed the 150,000 word mark not long ago, and I haven't introduced the main antagonist yet. I'm like 2/3 of the way through Act 1, and I was like, I guess that's just this story now. It'll be a great 5-book trilogy when it comes out one day.
In about a decade.
I feel like you just sort of need to sit down and with the information that you want to include or the information you have already researched and say, what absolutely needs to happen in this story? Do these certain details need to happen in this story? And if it doesn't, you don't have to throw them away or anything. That's just keep those for story number 2 or story number 10.
I'm trying to remember the name of the book. I think it was Beginnings, Middles, and Ends by Nancy Kress. It's part of the Writer's Digest series of books, which I generally think are very good books and useful for reading. But one of the things she really emphasizes in that book is the idea of a through line, right? What is the story about? And then what is it about in the beginning? What is it about in the middle? What is it about in the end? Well, if you have this through line, the story concept, the beginning is about setting it up. The middle is about dealing with the complications. The end is about dealing with the resolution of it. So if you ask that question about what you're working on, what is my through line? What is my purpose in this story? What is the drive? And then you go, okay, let me introduce it. Let me build a couple of complications. Let me resolve it. Then at the very least, that would give you an arc to work with. Now you might do the thing where I'm writing the arc, but oh, this other story sounds really fun. Let me go do this, which will probably happen. But at the very least, you could, again, have this outline. It is a very forced outline sort of idea that will keep you on a track towards a destination.
Yeah, I do joke about it, but there's ways to streamline. They always say, there are things you want to have in your pocket for if you're going to publish the story, and they say the elevator pitch, you have 30 seconds, here's what my story's about, or the 1-sentence plot summary. But even if you're not planning to publish it, you want to know those things. You want to have a clear idea of what the story is about, what are you trying to accomplish here? Because that way, when you're on some tangent, you have something to hold it up against. You can say, all right, the bunnies have constructed this system of government. That's pretty neat. Does it serve my mission statement, though? And then you have a litmus test for will this help or hurt my story?
I see we have about 10 minutes left in the panel, so we have time for 2 or 3 more questions, perhaps, depending on the length. Are you going to make us talk up here?
This
I
can't
have
end
one,
well.
just I'm trying to word it in my head. That's why I'm not very good writer yet, but
Yeah.
distance, time, and how much information is too much information? And
I have a perfect answer for this. So there's a story about J. Michael Straczynski, who is a well-known writer of science fiction and other things. He wrote the series Babylon 5, most notably. And apparently after Babylon 5 came out, of course a lot of additional products came out about it, and at one point they tried to build an RPG system, a tabletop RPG system, based on the show. And they kept running into the issue that they have these Star Furies that are their small personal spacecraft trying to get from point A to point B, and nowhere in the show does it state how long it takes. So they kept like sending him messages. They kept sending J. Michael Smith, okay, how long does it take? How fast do they move? And eventually he got so frustrated, he just said they move at the pace of plot. Right? They did what the story needed them to do to get from point A to point B because the actual details of it weren't that necessary. Now it's possible you're writing a story where it is really necessary. Maybe you're writing Game of Thrones where it should actually take a long time for a character to cross a country. But it depends on the story you're writing as much or as little as you feel you want to do.
Right. Because I asked, because bringing that up, I know two things. Legend of the Galactic Heroes, they're kind of vague on the whole how long it takes kind of deal. And that's another thing. Like, I know, I haven't watched it, but I know some of the War of Babylon 5 and the Minbari War. It was like, oh, Earth's under attack and genocidal aliens. What do you mean there's only 30,000 casualties or whatever? It was a very tiny number for, against genocidal aliens, figuratively speaking. So, and then you look at 40K and, oh, countless dead. Yep, that makes sense. So.
Yeah, you've got to think about like whether or not an exact number would meaningfully amplify the impact of what you're saying. If the conflict is that this ship has been teleported a really long distance, and you say like, oh no, we've been teleported 7,000 light years, and well, like, oh no, Neil deGrasse Tyson is going to tell you, well, it's not that very far actually. If you can say, just have the characters directly say, oh, even at top speed, it would take us 200 years to get back home. And that gets you around all the real science space stuff. Nobody's going to come to your door and tell you did it wrong because you left your math off the table.
I'm sorry, are we leaving math off the table now?
I mean, if you're prepared to do math, get it right.
Yeah.
That was another thing.
Okay, my degree is in nuclear engineering. I'm not prepared to put math in my writing because I can't do it right enough that people will not complain to me about it. Yeah.
I think this is a topic that's very important in the sci-fi panel, but I'll bring it up here as well, of just people always worry about that concept of write what you know, but how much do I need to research for the things that I don't know? And my general response to this is it depends how much research you needed to do to get to that point. If I can fact check you by searching on Wikipedia, you didn't do enough research.
Yeah.
If I need a PhD in the subject to check that you're wrong, then it's probably fine.
Because, again, I bring this up because Star Wars and Legend of Galactic Heroes, both space operas in their own right, the reason the ships in the Legend of Galactic Heroes fight that way is because they're fighting light seconds apart. And you're not going to hit anything light seconds apart, so you have to fight in thick formations, or else you're just going to be shooting each other and never hitting anything. And I bring this up again because in Star Wars, it seems like they just shoehorned this in the essential guide to starships. Oh, the Venator can hit something at 8 light seconds away. No, it can't. That's Earth to the sun. No, you're not going to hit something. Good luck hitting something at that range.
In point of fact, Earth is 8 light minutes away from the sun.
Oh, 8 minutes.
Yeah, that's why I leave my math off.
Seconds, minutes.
Orders of magnitude. But this is another spot where you can get into a tough position and engineer clever ways around it. Battlestar Galactica did that really well because they were saying okay, we just want to have ships that move at the speed of plot. How do we do that? They're faster than light ships. Charge up and do an instantaneous jump from one location to the other. The longer the jump is, the longer it takes to charge up the energy, the longer it takes to perform the necessary telemetry calculations and all of that. And the kick to it is, if you need to get there real bad, you can kind of round off the numbers on all the calculations and do the jump real quick, but something bad might happen. Mm-hmm. And so literally there is this plot-focused reason that how fast you can get and how far you can get are dependent entirely on how badly you need to get there.
Right.
You know, if everything's exploding around you, you can just hit the button and get out of there. Because they're just like, we might die. I'm like, explosions. We will also die if we stay here. And that's a great compromise. You can say like, this is just the nature of the technology,
Right.
rather than saying like, oh, well, it's this speed and that speed. You can also get into things like long-term space travel would have cryosleep. So you don't have to worry about everyone aging. You can address relativistic concerns. People don't age because you're going so fast, time doesn't pass. There's a lot of like slightly squishy science at the edges of relativity that you can use to your advantage.
You can also just call it aesthetic-driven sci-fi and kind of wave away a lot of that. Like,
Yeah.
you know, why do my ships look like this? You know, it's not a practical hard science fiction, but I wanted it to look like chunky, you know, Cold War technology.
Well, you can do that in space because you don't need aerodynamics.
Sure,
They
sure,
can
but
be
like,
shaped kind of like anything.
yeah, I was thinking more like your internals. Like, why do I have this
Mhm.
sort of thing when you know we moved past that? But
Yeah.
because the freaking aesthetics of aliens were really cool, and I want to incorporate that.
Well, yeah,
in
and
everything.
Star Trek used a lot of like smooth teardrop shapes for their ships, and then eventually someone asked them like why there's no air in space, and then eventually some writer went like, warp fields behave like liquids, so you need a smooth ship. Earn my paycheck that day. How do the Heisenberg compensators work? Great, next question.
I think that's an interesting observation in terms of like sometimes you just kind of go, you know,
Yeah.
plot stucco.
And again, this is true, again, not just of sci-fi, but more generally, because this is not the sci-fi panel, of just saying that if you are working in anything technical, you don't have to give the details. And because this is what will trip you up. If you don't work in a technical area and you're trying to write about it and you try to give the technical details, almost certainly you're going to be wrong about them. So just don't mention them.
Like the Venator Star Destroyer I brought up. Good luck hitting something 8 light seconds, 8
Yeah.
light minutes.
Don't give the exact number, and you're fine.
Yeah, that's the whole thing. Like when I wrote my nurse story, I went to a surgeon and bothered him for hours upon hours. Like because I was putting the details in, I'm like, I got to get these right because they're gonna be in there. And that's why I say like, oh, is math off the table? Like, how good's your math?
I think we have time for one more quick one. I see you've had your hand up.
I just want to bring this back up. Like, I keep going back to Hal Clement because, you know, one of the first really significant anthropomorphic works was Mission of Gravity. But that was written as a response to Jack Vance's Big Planet, where they had a planet that was the size of a small sun, and these people had to walk 40,000 miles across the planet, which is on one continent, to find. And then Vance is going, wait a second, any planet that big, the gravity was. So he created mescaline, which was a planet where the gravity is so intense that the apex species were intelligent centipedes. And that was, that was like one of the first really significant pieces of anthropomorphic sci-fi.
Yeah, and that is the first thing I thought of. Like, any star-sized planet would be a star, because anything with that much mass starts undergoing fusion due to its own gravity.
Yeah, and then what was interesting was when he was writing it, he actually talked with someone who was a physicist, and they were telling him all the things. So he tried to incorporate all this stuff inside it, and then about 2/3 of the way through, he gave up on trying to incorporate all the harder science into it. But everybody still looks at it and says it's a classic of hard sci-fi.
I believe we have hit our time. If there's anyone who has any questions that didn't get them answered, you're welcome to come up to us after the panel. But thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope you have a good rest of your con.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.